welcoming Dr. James Stock.
Thanks, Megan, and thank you, Michael. It is a pleasure to be here, and especially having heard so many great things about LaSalle College and about the village in particular from my wife, who is so happy to, she's probably told you that she's really happy to work here, but she's really happy to work here. And it is great to actually have the opportunity to see some of you, and perhaps we'll get a chance to chat a little bit afterwards too. I think I was told that something that was circulated said that this would go from 6:30 to 8:30. That is wrong. I was told that what I was told is that I'm supposed to talk for half an hour, sorta, and then we have 15 minutes more or less for questions, and then we can break. And I'll be here so we can follow up after that if anybody wants. I thought what I'd like to do is I was asked to talk about the economy and the coming election and some issues for the coming election that have to do with economics. And so I will do that. That is a tall order, so I'm going to take a little bit of liberty and narrow it down to a couple of issues that are of particular importance and try to focus in on those. And they seem unrelated, but they are in fact related. One of them is energy and climate-related policy challenges facing the next administration, whatever that might be. And the other one is budget challenges. And those seem like they're separate. There's actually some linkages between the two, and I'll clarify that. But before I start talking about those economist things and eyes start glazing over, I thought I would just tell you a little bit about what, for me, was truly one of the most exciting professional experiences I've ever had in my life, which was the opportunity to serve President Obama for 2 years as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors. Now, I really didn't know what I was getting into when I went down there. I did know that I'd be living down in Washington, and my poor wife would be holding the fort up here in Massachusetts, and she was a real trooper to do that. I learned a lot about how the administration works and how policy making works from the inside in the White House, and I would like to share a couple of insights that I have, or some of the experiences. The Council of Economic Advisors there's 3 of us on the council, and then there's about 30 staff members who are all economists. And our job is twofold. The first job is pay attention to the economy. So somebody in the White House has to be following the economy, and if there's some funny thing going on in the labor market or some funny thing going on in financial markets, we're the #1 point person for that. So that's our job. That's what we spend. Half of the time that the staff spend is just paying attention to what's going on in the economy in considerable detail. The president needs to know, and his senior advisors need to know, and so that's one thing we do. The other thing we do, that only takes about half of our time, and the rest of our time is we provide advice on economic-related policy matters. So policy that has to do with the U.S. economy, so not defense, not social policy, so not policing and law enforcement or anything like that, U.S. economic policy. We provide the professional economic advice as to what makes the policy perhaps efficient or inefficient or have unintended consequences. And it's at least in this administration, it's a very well organized machine where there's people representing different views, some representing political views, some representing social policy views, some representing, in our case, economic PhD views, and weighing in on the various policy issues that come up. And that was a very exciting opportunity. So 2 of the issues that we paid considerable attention to in both dimensions, but especially in the monitoring dimension, were energy climate in the first instance and the U.S. budget. So I'm going to talk about those two issues sequentially. So I'm going to start with energy and climate. And I think everybody I think a lot of people have heard that there's really been important changes in energy markets and important changes in the U.S. economy associated with that, and many of those changes are related to climate change. I'm going to show you a few pictures that really highlight that, and as I go through these pictures, I'll talk a little bit about some of their implications. Okay, so I'm an economist, and I was about to say, this is really a great chart. Okay, it's really a great chart. So this just encapsulates so many things that you knew when you were younger, and so many important changes that have occurred in just the last few years. This is a graph of U.S. net oil imports since 1974. And what you can see is that from roughly the mid-1980s all the way through the mid-2000s, we just kept importing more and more and more oil. And we started in the mid-1980s around 5 million barrels per day. By the mid-2000s, we were up to 12.5 million barrels per day of oil imports. And that's partly because the economy was growing, but it's partly because domestic reserves were declining. Alaskan oil was being used up and it was being produced less. And it was really expensive in some of the really remote places, offshore Alaska. So we just kept importing more, mainly from the Middle East, but lots of other places too. All of a sudden, things changed. Things changed around 2008. Two big things changed. First of all, there was a recession, so we just didn't need as much oil for a while. But the other really big thing that changed is that we started this new non-conventional oil and gas exploration, often referred to as fracking. Fracking, let me just digress for a second. We want to think of the technology of fracking is used both to extract natural gas and to extract oil. Right now I'm just talking about the oil piece of it. Okay? So that's really increased our oil production. And then there's been some other things too. We've had fuel efficiency standards in automobiles, and that's reduced our demand for oil. So we've had a number of things that have reduced our demand for oil, but it's really changed this picture of our dependence on the rest of the world for oil. We are still net oil importers, but it's a very, very different situation. And going forward, it allows presidents to be much less constrained by the political events in the Middle East, and more free in terms of their ability to act for the United States and not be so worried about oil security. Big deal. Here's another aspect that's a big deal. As I'm sure very many of you know, gas prices are super cheap right now. They're somewhere around $2 a gallon nationally. And so what this picture shows is this shows the weekly pump prices of gasoline, which rose all the way through the 2000s. They went way down during the recession and came back up again during the recovery. From 2010 to 2014, summer of 2014, they were floating around $3.50, sometimes approaching $4, depending upon where you're located, more than $4 a gallon. And over the last 18, 20 months, gas prices have just come down enormously. And why is that? Well, there's a couple of reasons. It all has to do with the price of oil. A little bit of that has to do with slack demand in China and the rest of the world's growth. The big chunk of it actually has to do, again, with the same thing we just were talking about, which is fracking and development of oil reserves by through non-conventional methods in the United States. Okay, so those are just background facts that are incredibly important. Obviously, this puts more dollars into the pockets of consumers, and so overall, this is a good thing for the economy. It's not so good for North Dakota, it's not so good for Texas, but for the overall economy, it's a good thing. The final picture I'll show is energy-related emissions of carbon dioxide. And so this is also a really interesting picture. There's a couple of things. There's a kind of a busy picture, and I want to point out a few things. First of all, if you just look at the overall totals see that same rise that we saw in gasoline, oil imports, all the way from 1980 through about 2005 or 2006. Since 2006, we've seen declining emissions. There's a couple of reasons why we've had declining emissions. One, again, is the recession. That's not a good energy policy. That's not a good environmental policy. It did result in a temporary decline in emissions. Another reason we saw this decline in emissions is because of improved energy efficiency and improved fuel economy standards. And then we're seeing sort of this plateau over the last few years. And that's an incredibly important thing as we look forward. Another point I want to make in this chart is that there's the big piece of CO2 emissions is coming from electricity generation. The next big piece is coming from transportation, cars driving around. And then all of the other stuff like oil. We have our home is heated by an oil boiler, and probably many of you, if you lived in New England, that's how you heated your homes too. And so that would be in this other category. Okay, let me show you one important feature right here. If you squint and you look at what's going on in transportation, there's been a nice decline, except now look in the last 2 years. Okay, the last 2 years, emissions from transportation have been going up. Well, why is that? Gasoline prices are really low. People are driving more consuming more gasoline and emitting more. Okay. There's some targets here. This is where we have pledged in Copenhagen that we would be in 2017. This is where we pledged in Paris just recently, last November, where we would be in 2025. These are super ambitious targets to be able to, I think we're on track to get to the Copenhagen target. I think to get to the Paris target, you can't just extrapolate this out. You've got to have some really serious policy that's going to get there. Okay, let me summarize one key point from this and then talk about what these implications are going forward for the election, which is what my charge was. One key point from this, these emissions of carbon dioxide have dropped for two main reasons. Reason number one is because we had a recession. Reason number two is in the electricity sector, natural gas, because of fracking, has been really cheap. So we've switched. That's just for pure economic reasons. A lot of what used to be a coal-fired generation has just switched over to natural gas. It's cheaper in a lot of places just to run the natural gas plants than to generate electricity than coal plants. None of that was policy. None of that was policy. So we think we're doing a good job. This is just luck. It's luck from the recession, which isn't really the kind of luck you want to have. And then it's luck from fracking. And there's essentially no policy aspect to this decline. Any future declines we're going to have to make, we can either rely on luck, so maybe we could have, I don't know, more recessions. I don't think there's any presidential candidate that would say our energy policy should be more recessions. That would do it, but that's not the greatest. Natural gas prices are already really low. We're already doing a lot of fracking. If anything, if we were to cut back on fracking, natural gas prices would be more expensive and we'd see emissions going up in the power sector. So we actually, from this point forward, we can't rely on luck, we have to rely on policy. And any policy that we do is going to be heavy lifting. The Environmental Protection Agency has promulgated rules about reducing carbon emissions from power plants. Those are very controversial. There's a Supreme Court case about that. They've been suspended or I don't know the right legal jargon. They've been suspended for the time being until all the court cases are resolved. They may or may not survive the court challenges. Their EPA has taken some risks legally. There's a little bit that we can do on fuel economy. Those are all really small pieces. To really reduce carbon-related emissions is a big job. And it's really a challenge to have policies that will actually accomplish that. There are very few policies that we have available to us that will accomplish that. Energy efficiency is not going to do the trick. Energy efficiency accounts for almost none of this decline. We've had constantly improving energy efficiency, but the rate of improvement of energy efficiency hasn't really picked up at all. This decline here is all just good luck. So challenge number one for the next administration in this area is what are the real policies that it's going to adopt to reduce carbon emissions. And it's not going to come from easy things like energy efficiency. Whatever it has to come from something affordable. If it's not affordable, it's not going to be sustainable politically. If we make people pay too much for it, they're not going to want to pay for it, and then Congress isn't going to support it. So there has to be something that's affordable and meaningful. There are some policies, but you've got to have wherewithal to actually make those tough choices. So I can talk about those if there's any interest, but that's just sort of looking forward. Okay, second topic, and this actually gets to the question of how much things cost and are we really able to spend a lot of money on this transition to a cleaner or a low carbon economy. And I think one of the challenges that we have to recognize in that context is that we have a large federal debt that we already hold, and that's going to be putting some constraints on any future fiscal policies that we are going to be implementing over the next administration, whoever that president is. I think it's useful. This picture is one from the Congressional Budget Office, and this picture shows the debt held by the public. Okay, so that's when we run a deficit, then the federal government issues bonds, treasury bills, and the general public buys them. I mean, some of you might actually own them, but more frequently they're held by mutual funds or by banks, but they're held by the general public. The general public, after World War, so what do we see here? We see a giant run-up in the debt. Well, that's World War II. We did a lot of deficit spending in World War II, and we had a really big debt afterwards. What happened after that? Look at this; it just disappeared. The big reason this actually just disappeared is that we had unexpected inflation. So we had a lot of people who were holding, for example, war savings bonds that carried very low interest rates, and then all of a sudden there was this big inflation for many years going through the Korean War, and that essentially meant that if you held those war savings bonds, by the end of the Korean War, those things just weren't worth very much. And so a lot of people broadly in the economy, broadly shared loss of wealth in the economy as a result of this inflation, brought the debt to GDP ratio down to a sustainable level. So that's one way you can reduce the debt. You can inflate it away by surprise inflation. Get everybody to hold war savings bonds. They have a fixed nominal value, and whoops, we have some inflation, and they're just not worth that much anymore. Okay, that's what we did here. Okay. There's another period of inflation, and this is a period of inflation associated with the Reagan tax cuts, which generated large structural deficits, and those large structural deficits accumulated year after year. On top of the deficit, there was a recession in 1991 that put a additional cyclical deficit on top of it. What happened here is this is this period of tremendous growth in the second half of the 1990s. And if you recall back, this was a period where there was lots of innovation in IT, and we had strong growth in the labor force and strong growth in the overall economy. We grew our way out of this deficit problem, this debt problem. This one we inflated our way out of it. This one we grew our way out of it. Okay, so now this comes to here we are, and this is entirely due to the recession. The current administration has, through its fiscal policy, intentionally ran a countercyclical deficit, and now has essentially brought that deficit to a plateau. So there's no more deficits that are adding to it. But then the question is, how are you going to get out of this one? And here the challenges are much tougher. We're not going to inflate our way out of it because the Fed's changed its inflation policies. So that's not going to happen. This easy way, the inflation way, is not going to happen. I would argue that this growth way is very unlikely to happen. That here there is a period of exceptional growth associated with an expansion of the labor force. We now are in a period where the baby boom is retiring. We're seeing not a contraction, but a very slow growth of the labor force. And that means that our whole fiscal capacity going forward is substantially challenged. The CBO baseline has our debt to GDP ratio running up to 86%. Based on the most recent budget that the president put forward, it's actually, the CBO has re-estimated it to be running roughly constant, somewhere in the vicinity of 75%. Not coming down, but at least not going up, and that's reasonable, at least not going up. The three presidential candidates for whom there's an organization called the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, which does a very good job analyzing the presidential candidates' budgetary positions. And the three presidential candidates' budgets that they've analyzed, I'll go from right to left. Here's the Cruz plan. So the Cruz plan has a number of different things. Their estimate of the Cruz plan is that the federal deficit, debt to GDP ratio, would go from about 76% today, not to that 86% in the CBO baseline, but to 131%. So it almost, over the course of the next 10 years, almost double the debt to GDP ratio in the United States. And the main reason for that is that there's big tax cuts in the Cruz plan that just are not, that don't have any offset in terms of spending. In the Trump plan, it's not very well articulated. And so I mean that in a technical sense. If you go to their website and you look for the details, there aren't any. So the best they're able to do is give a range, and based on their interpretation. And the range is, you start today at 76%. Remember, the current Obama budget brings this flat to just about 76%. The CBO baseline, which is more pessimistic for technical reasons, but it's because actually the CBO baseline is not technical reasons. It's because the CBO baseline for the president's budget, they say if the president's budget became law, this is what it would be, but we don't think it's going to become law, so this is what we think that Congress is going to do under the current scenario anyway. Okay, it is pretty funny. So under the Trump plan, debt to GDP ratios would rise to somewhere between 115 and 140% of GDP. So if we go back to those, just to put this in perspective, 115 to 140% is way more than we had at the end of World War II. Okay, so these are really big numbers. These are really big numbers. 114%, 140%. Okay. Sanders plan. The Sanders plan, there's a huge range of ambiguity depending upon how you interpret certain aspects of the spending part. The Sanders plan is pretty clear on the tax side. There's the place where there's the least clarity is on the health plan, and that's where there's a lot of money at stake. The various estimates range that they put forward, they have a range of estimates between 93% and 139%. Their preferred estimate is 93%. So the Sanders campaign says 75%, but that's based on optimistic assumptions. So this organization's, their preferred estimate is 93%, which I think if I had presented this first, that would sound like a lot, and it sounds like it's going in the wrong direction. It sounds conservative compared to these other plans. Surprisingly, they have not done an analysis of the Clinton plan, but I think I don't know why they haven't done it. It's kind of odd that they haven't done it, but in fact, the Clinton plan is very much like this budget that was recently proposed. The details of the Clinton tax and spending plan are very close to the details of the budget that the president just proposed a few months ago. There are a few differences. The president proposes a $10 a barrel oil tax. She doesn't do that. She does propose a higher end income tax surcharge. She doesn't do that. But those are sort of offsetting, and her plan is somewhere in this vicinity right here. So those are some comments about the fiscal outlooks for the different plans. I know that there's a million other things that I could talk about, but I thought it would just be useful to give some basics on this fiscal outlook. So those are the remarks that I was planning to make. And I'm more than happy to take some questions. Yeah, please, in the back. Oh, yeah. We do have...
Okay.
I help her here.
Okay. We have to do two.
All right.
There's someone way back in the back. I think that while we're waiting, I would just say, I guess just to wrap up, I've tried to talk about two areas where there's really big challenges over the next 4 years. One of them is in the budget fiscal space, and the other one is in the climate energy space. There are policies in the climate energy space that are in place. Their legal status is uncertain. If they survive the court challenges, then the next president has to face decisions about, am I going to continue down this path or not? If they don't survive the court challenges, then there's really major challenges that the next president's going to have to make if they want to make progress on climate change. It's not easy. I would say the only candidate that actually has a really serious proposal that would make a big difference on climate change is Sanders, in the sense that Sanders actually proposes a carbon tax. Carbon tax, if the Republicans continue to hold the House, is just not going to happen. So this is a really hard space to make policy progress in. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask a couple of minor questions. Not really minor. Economists generally don't like to give specific answers to broad questions. And I don't blame them, because it's not known as the dark science for no reason at all. But the question I want to ask is, do we have any kind of reasonably hard evidence as to what constitutes an unsustainable ratio of debt to gross national product? And what kind of evidence is there that changing that has effects on other parts of the economy and has negative effects on the public and their, basically there's quality of living?
Yeah, so that's a really terrific question. So essentially the limiting factor is, at what point do you have to start paying really high rates of interest on your debt? So the negative spiral that's happening in Greece, that's happened in Argentina, that's happened in countries that have let this really get out of control, is when your debt to GDP gets so high that people start wondering, gosh, are you really going to be able to pay it back? If you're really not going to be able to pay it back, then we're going to charge you more interest, and then it's a death spiral, because there's higher interest, you can't pay that back, people get even more worried, and then you have to do some really either a default or a massive, like Argentina did, or a massive restructuring. And then the question is, and then there's a lot of people who lose, and you lose. Argentina lost for decades. So then the question is, where does that actually happen? Where that's going to happen for the United States, which is a well-functioning democracy, is probably going to be north of where it would happen for Argentina. I think that at the 70% range, the 80% range, the 90% range, there's really nobody, that's too strong a statement. The IMF doesn't have concerns. Our administration doesn't have concerns. That the Fed doesn't have concerns. Those seem to be very sustainable levels for us. I think if you start talking about 130% or 150%, those are where empirical evidence from other countries, and that's all you can do is piece together that's where there seems to be some inflection in interest rates, and that's where things could start getting really challenging. And so you can imagine getting there through a number of different mechanisms. One mechanism might be we have another big recession, and so there's going to be more cyclical debt associated with that. But I think the real worry is, if we're not going to be able to inflate our way out, and if we're not really going to be able to grow our way out, how do we think about this ever ratcheting up? And it's really this ratcheting up that would be the concern. But the short answer is, I would use a number somewhere in the 130 range that would make me get really worried. I'm not worried right now, but seeing these projections that we'd be going up to the 130 range, that certainly worries me.
Hi, so you're probably aware that the Heritage Foundation and many other conservative outlets insist that high deficits result in low growth. I think the literature suggests that there's a correlation between high deficits and low growth, but I've wondered if it's the other way around, that low growth results in high deficits. Which do you think it is, and what are your reasons?
Well, it's going to be both. Certainly low growth, we were a recession is a perfect example. We had a recession where we actually had negative growth, and the recession and the deficit went up partly because of countercyclical spending, but partly just because tax receipts go down, and so you're going to have a deficit as a result of low growth, and that's going to accumulate into a rising debt as a result of low growth. So that channel is there for sure. That's more of a cyclical thing, and then the challenge of a country that has low growth. If they have a spending that's in line with their taxes, there's no reason that they have to have a debt to GDP ratio that's increasing. It's a matter of adjusting those so that they're in line in the long run. I think that the Heritage Foundation type argument, and certainly this is what I was just referring to, there is a legitimate reason to worry about deficits being too high. You have to pay more on that interest, and that interest then is going to just if you have higher interest rates in the whole economy, that means that firms are going to have to pay more for when they borrow to build plants. And that means the required rate of return on new projects is going to be higher. And that means that investment in projects that would move the economy forward and be productive is going to be tougher to have. So high interest rates as a result of a high federal deficit, high federal debt, is the mechanism whereby that reduces growth. And that's a legitimate concern. And then the question is just where. And we're certainly not seeing it today with the interest rates that we have today. I would expect that we would see that if we were up in the 130 range. Yeah.
It's been suggested by my favorite economist, Paul Krugman, that now is a good time to borrow, for the federal government to borrow money, because interest rates are so low. We could invest in infrastructure and other things that would create jobs that would actually end up paying off that debt. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, so I think that's, so there's an awful lot of points all rolled up into that statement. Point number one, do we need to improve the infrastructure in the United States? Yes, it's a mess, okay? So it's terrible, and we would have a more productive economy if we spent on it sensibly. So that's question number two is, does it make sense as a temporary matter to borrow when interest rates are low to do productive investments like infrastructure? Yes, okay, so I'll have to agree with that. The question then, the trouble is what we're not good at is making those deficit spending decisions temporary. And that's where I guess I would worry that about this ratcheting, this permanent ratcheting up effect. And so while I absolutely agree that if we could somehow tie our hands that after we fixed infrastructure and then rejigger the tax system that we be back at a budget neutral setting, that would be terrific. But that's an incredibly difficult thing to do politically. You can see what the candidates propose. What the candidates propose is a lot more palatable to the electorate. It's a lot easier to propose that we're going to cut taxes and not do anything about spending, or maybe ensure that we have more Social Security. But that's tough. So I guess I get a little bit worried about the longer term consequences of Paul's recommendations, even though I understand the short term. The short term arguments are really sound ones. Yeah.
Chairman, I have two questions. The first one, in your work, what do you see as the relationship between the proposals we hear about ending the trade pacts versus interest rates, how interest rates would be affected?
Yeah, I think, okay, so that's a great question. So I think in the first instance, I wouldn't say that the major thing about the trade pacts is really the relationship to interest rates. That the interest rates are based on things more, they're based on short-term cyclical things such as Fed policy, and they're based on longer-term structural things such as debt to GDP type ratios and overall productivity of the U.S. economy. I think what the trade issues are more closely related to is our jobs in the United States and overall access to goods internationally. The traditional argument that we've always made, that economists have always made, is that trade is a good thing because we specialize in things that we're good at and they specialize in things that they're good at, and overall that means that everybody is more productive and therefore there's more resources and we're better off and they're better off. I think that what we're realizing now is that of course it's not that easy homogeneous story, that you see lots of people who are really hit by trade. I don't know whether you read the article yesterday morning in the New York Times about this recent study looking at where do you really see the polarization in voting. You see it in the most trade impacted areas and the ones that were most exposed to competition with China. And that's a longer history. That's where we've been seeing increasing inequality. So a lot of the problems that are facing real people in the economy and are posing real political challenges are associated with trade. So I think that a lot of economists are revisiting that. I know I'm of a mixed mind on this.
Second question. You're in charge of political operation research. Take a look at those figures or those categories. How would you be attacking the various candidates' proposals if you were in charge of opposition research?
Well, fortunately, I'm not. I think I would be terrible at that. I'm an economist. I'm not a political.
You're red or blue?
Well, I worked for President Obama. It's very clear where my allegiances are. I think I guess one comment I would make on all of these budget things is that these are important things to keep in mind, but the odds of any of these coming to pass are so slim. First of all, you'd have to have both the Congress and both the House of Representatives and the Senate and the President to be in the same party. All right, and then you'd have to actually have the Senate have enough votes to get over the opposition party veto. So for Sanders to get through, for Sanders' proposals to get through, he's got to have 60 votes in the Senate and the Republicans in the House. It's like, that's maybe, but that seems really remote. And for Cruz to get through, or for Trump's proposals to get through, it's the same story. And so I think that I think that the best we can hope for, realistically, is that whatever comes out of this gridlock that we're likely to see over the next 4 years, a responsible gridlock is that blue line, and that's the president's 2017 budget. And I'm obviously expressing favoritism, and so again, to express favoritism, the president's 2017 budget is pretty much the Hillary Clinton fiscal proposal. And that's realistic. I think that's realistically something that we can achieve. We're not going to be lowering the debt to GDP ratio. We'll be making some good marginal progress in different dimensions. We're not going to be increasing the debt to GDP ratio, and we'll be having good policy in other areas. And I think that realistically, that's what we can hope to achieve. If we really have gridlock and nothing can get passed, then we might be up at this red dotted line, and that's just current policy, business as usual. So let's hope that we can do better than that.
I have a question regarding the interaction between politics and energy. And in particular, you showed us in an early graph regarding using oil at the moment as the example, that over a period of time, because of technology, conservation, and fracking, our dependence, particularly on the Middle East, but really on any foreign countries, for our main source of energy has been declining, and recently quite rapidly. My question is, seems to be, whether it's fracking or other methods, an increase that we could do politically and from the energy sector to be self-sufficient in our use and non-importing of oil. And I was wondering whether you and the council or anybody has, I'm sure you have, in one way or another, done a projection forward that technologically that's possible, but the impact on global economy and global politics is another matter.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you might comment on that.
Has anybody done those projections? The EIA, Energy Information Administration, actually has done those projections, and I think they're likely to redo them in a report that'll be coming out very shortly. It's actually quite challenging. It's interesting. It looks like you can just continue this straight line. It's not quite clear that you can just continue that straight line. It would require really a substantial increase in the amount of fracking. It would require really unexpected improvements in vehicle technology and fuel efficiency, and it require driving cutbacks that are not consistent with most projections. So it's a little unlikely that we would actually be down to zero. But going in that direction for sure is a desirable feature for the U.S. economy and for the international politics. In terms of the and there's policies that can support that. I know fracking is very, very controversial, but I'm just speaking from the economics perspective. That has merit. There's also renewable fuels domestically. So we have a lot of ethanol that we grow in the Midwest that's in our fuel supply, and that actually shows up on that chart. That's part of the story there too. And for more we have in place, and we can continue to support policies for more for vehicle fuel economy standards. So all of those things we can actually influence through policy. In terms of how this changes our international political stand, I probably shouldn't even answer because that's not my area of expertise. But it's clear that it really frees us from some of the binds that we need. If you just look at how our relationship with Saudi Arabia and the president's relationship with Saudi Arabia has changed now versus even when President Bush, the previous President Bush, was interacting with Saudi Arabia in the mid-2000s. So we have a very different relationship with that country now.
Well, just to add on to that comment, could you comment on what's the thinking in terms of fracking, and if we care about, environmental issues and all of that, and living near places that are being fracked?
Yeah, so this is a really good question. Like almost everything, there's pluses and minuses, and I've talked a little bit about some of the pluses. The other plus that I would want to stress is not the oil, which is what we're looking at here, but on the natural gas side. So if we think about Pennsylvania doesn't have the oil fracking, it has the natural gas fracking. And what that's led to cheap natural gas. Cheap natural gas has led to reducing the amount of coal that's being used to produce electricity, and that's reduced greenhouse gas emissions. It's reduced particulates. It's reduced sulfur dioxide emissions. It's reduced ozone. It has lots of positive features switching from coal to natural gas, and it's all because of cheap natural gas so far. It's not because of regulation. So, but there's downsides, okay? So, and the downsides have to do, I think, to a large extent with local environmental concerns. So there's concerns about water quality, and there's seismic concerns too, about some re-injections causing earthquakes and that sort of stuff. I think it's, and there's a third concern, which is kind of in the weeds, which is if you have these fracking oil and gas wells, or gas wells, every now and then they need to, there's places that methane can leak out of them, and if the methane leaks up to the atmosphere, that's also a greenhouse gas. So there's a whole host of issues with these that my view is that all of those are really important. They all need to be addressed at the appropriate level, and they all need to be addressed through the appropriate regulation. Fugitive emissions from oil and gas production wells are being addressed now by EPA through proposed regulations, through the BLM and DOI, Department of the Interior and Bureau of Land Management, for regulations for oil and gas wells on their lands. So these are actions that are being taken now to reduce fugitive emissions. The water quality issues are more challenging because they're not federal jurisdiction. The federal government doesn't have jurisdiction over these water quality issues. Those are state jurisdictions. Different states have taken different degrees of aggressiveness in terms of dealing with it. But federal help and then state implementation is something that needs to be done. There's a lot of controversy about whether or not it's actually bad. There's research that's going on. It's well-funded research, and we're learning more about that. To the extent that there are problems, they need to be addressed. The seismic problems are very local. Those need to be addressed, and those, I think they're being addressed too late, but they are starting to be addressed. Oklahoma has put on major steps to at least acknowledge that this problem exists. That's not quite as good as resolving it, but it's moving in the right direction.
But it used to be that the chemicals they put into the water, they didn't have to disclose.
Yeah.
Has that changed any?
There's problems about disclosure of chemicals. I should say that the technology has really advanced from the earliest fracking. They've learned there were problems for sure with the earliest fracking. They've learned how to do things like make the wells in such a way that these don't leak out. They're able to use fewer chemicals. I'm not going to say that everything is perfect. What I'm saying is that there is a path towards making this a safer technology, and that involves local regulation. It involves, I think it does involve having the chemicals being disclosed, it maybe not to the public, but at least to the federal government, so some response can be done in case of emergencies. But I think that this is I guess I would take the optimistic view that we have the structures in place legally and by regulation to address these problems.
When you say things are well funded, are you looking at who's funding them?
A lot of the work on fugitive emissions, which I know the funding source is best, are being done by the Environmental Defense Fund and the NRDC joint with industry. So it's a model of collaboration between industry and the environmental groups, then funding scientists to go in and do the monitoring and so forth. So I think the research can be done well.
Among some of the presidential candidates, we hear a lot about bringing jobs overseas back to this country. But in point of fact, won't many of those jobs actually disappear by virtue of automation and robots? And if that is so, what have the economists or people interested in employment projected in terms of what is the distribution of the nature of work a decade or two from now?
Again, that's a great question. So there's a number of questions within that. In terms of literally bringing those jobs back, I think that's I think one way to think about it is that what can we do to make manufacturing more competitive internationally? And so I think what you've seen through this unfortunate winnowing out process is you've actually seen a real transformation in manufacturing, where manufacturing now is really incredibly high tech domestically, and it really focuses on very sophisticated products. And all of the traditional manufacturing has been clothing is made in China. Do we want to actually have clothing being made back in South Carolina again? It's not obvious that we do. I mean, it's better that ideally we'd have the education programs in place so that people could earn more than they would earn working in a clothing manufacturing job. I mean, this next question, the next question of what are jobs going to look like 20 years from now when we have computers that can do accounting and computers that can do a lot of what we think of as the knowledge worker type jobs. Boy, I don't know. I think that's a real tough question. I guess I just have to continue to be an optimist, which I am about technology, and just hope that we're going to be able to have the people winning over the computers.
At best, what if oil, wind, and natural sources, solar could produce what percentage of our energy?
So that's a really good question. So the question, I'll repeat it, was what percentage of our energy can be produced by wind and solar? So I'm going to say what the long-term goal has to be. The long-term goal has to be, say, 2060, maybe 2070, 100%. Okay.
Yeah.
We have to decarbonize the power sector. I'm sorry. I'm now expressing an opinion. I have done a lot of reading on climate change science. I think climate change science, I have no reason to doubt the experts, and I'm completely convinced. If we want to keep temperatures to somewhere in the 2.5 or 3 degree range, we're going to have to. The politicians say 2 or 1.5. That ain't going to happen. I think if we really do a good job, if we really get our act together, we might be at 2.5 or 3 degrees. And to do that, we've got to decarbonize the transportation sector. We've got to decarbonize the power sector. The power sector needs to be decarbonized by 2060, say. So 100% is the answer to your question. It sort of has to be. So then the question is, how do you get there? You're going to need massive transformations in how the grid works, and most importantly, you're going to need really major advances in storage technology. So there's going to be more decentralization, but there's going to be a lot more storage. Maybe it's going to be batteries, maybe it's going to be something else. I mean, we've got to figure. Here's a place where I think it's completely realistic to be a technological optimist. I mean, how many people 20 years ago would have thought we'd be all walking around with iPhones and so forth, or how many people 20 years ago would have thought that it would have been plausible to have solar panels on top of everybody's roofs. And that's now plausible. I think it's completely plausible 20, 30 years from now. We will have figured out really good models for grid storage. So I'm actually of all of these different things in the energy sector, I'm the most optimistic about being able to make progress in electricity and decarbonizing that sector if we have suitable policy in place. If we don't, then we're just going to be doing cheap natural gas forever.
There are a couple of things we haven't touched on. One of them is the question of our disappearing middle class. I mean, we have people who can't afford to buy drugs, and I actually wrote to my congressman, asked him about that, and he said he had a bill that's been traveling through Congress probably for a couple of years. So it looks to me that that's not going to result in anything. At the same time, we have Social Security, in which the beginning age doesn't correspond anymore to what people actually live to. So the natural thing would be to have a higher starting age, say 70 would seem reasonable, but there's no appetite for that. So it looks to me like the solutions are there, but nobody seems to really do anything except to verbalize about that. And then we have also the question of armaments. We are armed, we bristle with guns and everything, and that also drains the budget a lot, but nobody addresses that. So how can we get people to focus, apart from verbalization, on doing something about these various items that need attention?
So I'm going to just comment on two of these points, which are really insightful. So raising the Social Security retirement age, back when Social Security was originally started, in the retirement age of 65, there were a lot of people who didn't live that long. This was really meant to be something that the last few years of your life, at last, you didn't have to work. Now, of course, we have people who are really healthy at age 65 and are happy to continue working or want to continue working. And having the Social Security retirement age go up is a completely sensible thing from an economics perspective. So that is really just a political problem. I mean, I hope you don't get quoted on that, because you'll probably have your AARP membership revoked. The other thing, I think the hollowing out of the middle class is a tremendous problem, and I guess it's really hard to point to really sort of compelling policy solutions in the short run. I guess what I keep going back to, and what many economists keep going back to, is the importance of having higher quality primary and secondary education and better access to some post-secondary education. So if you look at the Clinton proposal to have free community college, that really is a step in the direction of taking people who might have had not such a great high school education, but allowing them then to get those 2 years that are going to position them to be much more productive members of society and have better paying jobs. So that's the Sanders plan is a more ambitious version of that. But they're both they're both in the direction of actually trying to take some serious steps. Another serious step, there's a lot of research that indicates that early childhood education, pre-K education is very important. And there's a lot of nuances, and I'm not an expert, but that's an important area also to be thinking about how one can support that. It's not necessarily for all families, and some families maybe it's not the right thing, but making sure that sort of early childhood education is available. So those are a few ideas, but boy, this is, I mean, really solving, I don't think anyone has a really good answer to solving this. This is one of the big unresolved economic problems of our time.
Professor
we need
Scott,
to,
you started by sharing with us some of your experiences in the White House. Perhaps a way to wrap it up would give us a little more inside baseball in the White House. What was it like to work with President Obama, and how sophisticated was he in his view of economics?
Yeah, he's a really smart guy. Really quick, and you know what's amazing? So I think there's a couple of things that I took away. I mean, there are a lot of things I took away. One of them is that is just an unbelievably difficult job. I just don't see how, you know, it's so easy for us to look at these. Until I actually went down and worked in the White House, I didn't really think of presidents as human beings, but they're just people. Like, he grew up somewhere, and you know, he went to college, and like, he's just like a person. And to think of a person doing that job, it's just an impossible job. I mean, he's got to be on top of what I'm talking about right here. And then I talk about the changing relationship with Saudi Arabia. Well, he's the one who implements that. And there's all these decisions and all these pressures, and I just don't see how a human being can do it. I mean, it's incredible. Anyway, you know, he does it. And he's an incredibly smart guy, and really a great student of many of these issues. So, and is very, very, very deeply knowledgeable. So it was a real exciting privilege to be able to work for him.
Great question.